Hi there, this is Tim.
And Keaton Clark. I'm a first-year painting student and also a hand model.
Today, Keaton is voicing over this video with me as well as modeling for me. So we're going to be painting Keaton's hand here. And this is the third video in our uh, uh, anatomy feature studies. So we've done the torso, we've done the arm, now we're laying into the hand. And what we're going to see here with the hand is somewhat similar to what we saw with the torso and somewhat similar to what we saw with the arm. We're just going to see it happen a little bit faster and kept a little bit more gestural. So this would be how I would paint something quite a bit looser, depending on the painting style I'm utilizing. So I wouldn't do as much of the real softening and that we did in the first film. You know, the careful tiles and the softening. Not quite as much as the softening and then the gentle buildup we saw in the last video, but this is really going to be all over kind of block in like we saw sort of in both, but just very quick and very simple, and then from there just sort of a few strokes on top to help push the sort of gestural quality and the abstraction through. So we're going to intend is to keep this a very loose hand, very sort of abstract and very suggested, really, more than anything else. So as a result, you know, this is a bit faster of a video. We're keeping it much more gestural, so we're only going for about an hour here. But of course, that hinges on everything going pretty smoothly and us being able to hit our drawing pretty quickly. This drawing, of course, is just an ultramarine blue and burnt sienna here that I've created sort of a generic brown with. And I only spent the first minute and a half on that drawing, and now we're actually going to start laying into some actual color here, really digging into sort of the meat of it, trying to hit the nail on the head as much as I can with a big, broad, you know, firm brush, really loaded with paint. This is a fairly textured canvas, so it can hold a lot more. So I'm not approaching it with the sort of soft comber that I did with the torso. I'm really getting in with an ivory, which is the stiffest in the line by Rosemary. And really good for shaping and sculpting and really slamming down a bunch of paint. My color palette that I'm using here, a little different than what I've used in some of the previous anatomy study videos, but it's the same palette used in the extended still life that we saw in the last term. So nothing new there. This is a set of colors by Rublev. They're a little bit more classical in nature, you know, in that they're a little more neutral. Not as intense and vibrant, but it really helps to keep things a little more sort of in the human, natural, low chroma flesh range, and then we can lean the colors easily one direction or another. So I've got just a couple yellows, a couple reds, and a couple blues here instead of that full palette that I've been using the last few videos. We're just laying in these big broad chunks here. Whenever I can identify a color family clearly, I'm trying to just slam it right in there. Notice how I'm holding the brush at the very back. This keeps me from noodling too soon. I really want to get just some of the bigger, broader color relationships in here, really firmly placed. No timid nature whatsoever. And you know, it's better if it's confidently placed and a little incorrect, because I can go right on top of it and really load up the color, really adjust it as needed. But I need some color down there to work with first. The whole premise of this type of painting is that I'm going to almost be kind of sculpting with it, but first I've got to get it up there, just sort of like a sculptor with clay here. Got to slam some clay down so I can start pushing some forms.
Yeah, you're really just gone for it. The drawing was like a minute and a half, you said?
Yeah, a minute and a half, and then we'll jump right into the painting. But of course, if you do your drawing at home and you only spend a minute and a half on it and it's pretty weak, then I would not recommend jumping into the color. You know, even though I did it fast and simple, it was still fairly accurate, and so that allows me to move forward. Otherwise, you'd want to stay in that drawing stage until you've really sorted through some of the shapes a little more specifically. Now, because this is a more dynamic hand pose that I'm having him do, and I'm having him actually hold something, it's a little bit more challenging. We'll actually see more of a variety of hand shapes that happen throughout this pose, more so than we do on pretty much any other video. And as a result, I do modify and shift some of the drawing and shift some of the shapes as we go throughout. So for example, right now I have the pointer finger a little more extended, and then at some point it comes back in a little bit, and I find that to be a little more interesting, and so I readjust some of the drawing to accommodate that. Some of the angles and bends get adjusted a little bit, and so I crop and carve out a little based off of how that develops. I can do that because I've thrown so much paint on here that it's a little easier to sort of push around and sculpt like that. Whereas if I was going very careful tiling, very slowly trying to mix the color, then these changes would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to work with. I'd have to make extra certain that I push Keaton back into the right pose every single time to make sure I don't destroy all my previous work. So again, this method keeps us a little freer and a little looser and a little more open to the change, but it does hinge on this sort of idea that I'm confident and comfortable enough to make these changes very fast and very rapidly, and not too timid with my application. I'm really just willing to throw it on in there.
So, did you choose this working method because I'm a bad model?
No, I mean I chose it because we haven't done it yet.
Okay.
And so it's good to sort of see this and sort of see how adjustments can be made to the model. Unfortunately, we don't have a camera on your hand, so we don't actually see the shifting that takes place. But the picture-in-picture, what we see here on the left, actually represents the final pose that you ultimately end up taking, which is a little bit more rotated to the side. We see that the thenar needs to get bulked out as the rotation happens. And then, of course, the angle and the tilt of the front finger. And then ultimately, because of that rotation that happens, where the thenar needs to be adjusted, we end up seeing some of the back fingers, which I can't see in the initial pose. And so, I see a little more dimension to the hand, and that's why I ultimately decided to go with that change. The changes reflected more anatomy than the initial pose, and so I feel that they became a positive change, especially for a study that's about anatomy. This type of working method, I would say, is probably a little more similar to how like a Franz Hals would end up doing things, really following these big planes and these big shapes and really blocking in a lot of color, and then kind of softening things out at one point, and then just going over with some of these more finishing strokes that help keep it feeling loose and vibrant and very bold.
Mm-hmm. Do you kind of choose this method for demonstrations just because it's kind of more exciting to watch? Because everything kind of happens so fast, and then you're right into coloring.
It depends on what I'm trying to teach. So, or also how much time I might have, certainly. But so it just kind of depends. Largely, it ends up being a matter of what I kind of envision the final product to be like. If I'm not trying to demonstrate on a specific concept or a specific method, which sometimes happens. But you're right. Certainly, it is a little bit more exciting to do for the public. But I don't always want this type of finish in my work. Sometimes I want a more careful, studied approach. Sometimes I want a really, really super clean modeled approach. It just depends on what I want to ultimately end up having for the aesthetic of the piece.
Did you never tell me to get off my phone?
Apparently not. Well, you're talking now, so you might not be on your phone, or you might just be reading something about your phone.
About my phone?
Yeah. Keaton keeps me up to date with all of the social media happenings in the world and all the art news that I don't get because I'm too busy painting and editing videos. You can see I'm following some of the direction of the form there. I just wrapped right around the wrist bones there, and then I jumped back down and worked my way towards the thumb, working all around the thenar there, coming back in. So I'm just slowly carving and molding. This is a lot of walking the form. We kind of mentioned that a little bit at the beginning of the drawing with the torso. Now we're going to start to see a little bit more of it with the painting, because that's essentially what this is. It's this big gestural swoop from one form to another form and dancing back and forth and all around, while slowly mixing the color each time and applying new color while you carve out new forms and while you adjust and correct the drawing and strengthen it. And so I would say this represents sort of a really high level of working process, because you have to contemplate so many things at once It's not quite the same demand as a really direct alla prima, in which you're hitting the nail on the head with shape, value, edge, color, and paint application all at once and then moving on to the next stroke. But it does carry this idea that you have to be comfortable enough um, modifying and adjusting color while you correct drawing and making sure your chromas all stay on cue, and then really ensuring that the anatomy is suggested. So there's a lot of things you have to be thinking about all at once, and the faster you can think about them, the more loose and gestural you can be, which becomes more exciting both to watch and to actually do. So sometimes, I'll do this type of painting method, especially if I only have 45 minutes or an hour to paint something, and I just really want to kind of loosen up and have a little bit more fun playing and pushing the paint around, because it does, to some degree, become a little bit more intuitive. And that tends to typically translate to most people as being a little more fun. It's less of the rigid, super intensive contemplation and more of the, oh yeah, jump from here to here to here and bounce all around and swirl this and do this, and so that that can be really fun. But I did not like to do this for a long period of time. I kind of did this with color studies because I recognized the need to get better with color. But as for an actual painting technique, I did not do this because I was always so concerned with being very careful and really forcing myself not to make mistakes and really learn how to draw and to observe carefully. And now it's only after so many years of doing this that I feel like, okay, my skills of observation are high enough, my skills at mixing back and forth and high chroma, low chroma are strong enough, and my sense of values is also pretty strong, as well as my ability to just adapt in general to things that happen. Changes in the model, changes in the environment, changes in materials. I can adapt to that sort of stuff a lot more easily now than I could 5 years ago. And so this is something that I feel more comfortable and thus enjoy a little bit more now than I did prior. Because if I paint this way and it doesn't come out well, then it's not really an enjoyable painting experience for me. A lot of my enjoyment comes in with the final product, and so if the final product doesn't turn out how I envision it, then it's hard to overcome that and be satisfied with my time spent. I've switched to a smaller brush now, and I'm still kind of doing big drawing. You notice me making sort of big sweeping changes and moving all around. I'm just doing it with a little bit more precision with the smaller brush. This canvas is it is still a linen, but I believe it might actually be an acrylic primed linen instead of an oil primed linen, and it's very, very textural. So stuff is drying and setting up pretty fast, and that allows me to be actually quite a bit more forceful with my paint application. Just using a bristle brush here and really sort of scrubbing and pushing, scraping, and really molding the paint. Whereas if this were an oil primed surface or a slicker, smoother tooth linen, it would be a little bit harder to do that with. Going in with these darks pretty soon here, relative to what we've seen in some other videos. Hitting those dark accents right away, trying to get a full range of color, full range of value, really gets an impression of what's up there pretty fast, and hence, that's why they call this more of an impressionistic style of working. Now the lighting on the hand here is pretty directional and pretty strong, and probably not as dynamically clear as we could have made it for a hand. A lot of the hand is just sort of flushed with light, so a lot of the changes that are going to happen have to be done with color and also potentially with the paint application strokes to suggest directional elements and suggest little pieces of anatomy. So, if you're setting this up at home, you might want to consider a pose that more describes the roundness of the back of the hand, for example. Maybe has a hand that has fingers that are clustered or grouped together to make a more obvious shape. That's something that I've talked a lot about in class, looking at those classical ways of modeling hands, grouping the fingers so that from a distance it immediately reads as a recognizable hand shape that has a nice aesthetic and not just with the fingers all clustered together looking like an oven mitt. So unfortunately, this won't be the first time that we see me paint something and paint it pretty fully and then have to wipe it off and change it. We do see that in some of the later videos, actually. But, sometimes it has to be done. And hopefully the goal is, you do enough of these paintings and you practice enough and study enough and you're comfortable enough with whatever painting technique you are focusing on that if you identify a better painting by making a change, like for example the posture of this finger, or later on what we see in the final figure painting is I repaint an entire arm. If it increases the painting, if it makes the painting better, then it's worth the change, even if it's a lot of labor involved. Hopefully you get enough experience under your belt where you can sort of foresee those problems even before they start. And the more I look at a pose and the more I study a pose before I start painting it, the more I can alter the model or reposition myself to avoid some of those awkward elements that I might want to end up repainting later. And it's really just when you're not paying attention that those things sort of slip in and you might end up rendering them out a certain way that's not as strong as you had initially hoped, or just not as favorable as they could be. Trying to seek out the contour of that thumb with that reflected light and on the outside of that hand. A lot of that will get painted over, but it does help me to understand some of the anatomy of the thumb there. You'll notice I'm starting to slow down a little from that initial block-in. That initial block-in was very intuitive and very gestural, and now I kind of have to stitch together some pieces and refine some pieces and introduce a few more elements. So that's a process that's a little bit slower if I want to ensure that I retain some of my initial marks and some of my initial colors. I don't want to ultimately paint over all of that. I want to hopefully utilize a lot of that. So it's going to require that I mix a little more carefully to get into some areas and just take a little more care in here. And keep in mind, we're still in the first sitting with Keaton, or we might be just getting into the second. Pretty close here, but it's this is all in the first 20 minutes, and in most of the other videos, this stage would have taken at least an hour or more to get to. But hopefully, you're keeping up on your color studies, and you've done enough of these anatomical studies, over and over, like in drawing, that you're comfortable enough with the drawing, and you can really start to lay some of the stuff in here.
Was that the end of the first sitting?
I'm not sure yet.
I kind of saw like a fade in, fade out.
Oh, okay, then yeah, we're into the second sitting now. So I think we have 3 sittings total here, 3 20-minute blocks that comprise the video. And so each sitting has a slightly different hand position, and so we're going to see some remodeling and resculpting, I think, after each sitting here. But keep in mind, I will only make the change if I think it improves the quality of the painting itself. if it's a change just for the sake of the model moving, I would never chase it. And that's something that you should be quite aware of, especially if you're a student or a student working in a group situation, where there's a potential for that model to shift. If it's not better and if the group hasn't agreed on the shift, you need to make sure you're vocal enough to get the model back into a pose. There's a dangerous sort of mentality that a lot of people in OpenStudio have that, oh, it's just practice, so it doesn't really matter if the model moves and somebody has to change their whole painting, or I've heard, oh, you're an artist, you should deal with it. Well, yeah, I mean, that would ideally be great, but as a student, you need to learn how to paint first before you learn how to deal with the model moving and taking a completely different pose, which alters the structure and alters all of the light. So really try to be faithful to what's there and get the model back into pose if you can. And if you're painting with a group that just doesn't allow the model to be corrected back into the right pose, I would suggest finding a different group until you become a more advanced painter. Most reasonable painters would allow the participants of an open studio to correct a model, though.
And I think the model's more than willing to.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception that you're doing the model a favor by not having her get back into the pose.
Mm-hmm.
But if anything, I think it creates more anxiety later on. The model is trying to do a good job. The model is trying to be in the right pose, but they can't see themselves. And so rather than waiting until almost the end where everybody's in a huff because they haven't been able to paint anything because the model's been shifting, it's better to just help the model position into the correct pose, and then everybody can move forward a little happier. I'm still using bristle brushes to apply paint, really just loading it on there. More and more paint, more paint, and that's going to be the requirement when I've built up so much like I've built up now. If I'm too timid with the paint or if I thin it out too much, I will not be able to affect noticeable color and value changes on what's up there. There can be a danger also in being too close to your canvas when you're making these strokes, because from up close you may lay a stroke down that looks like it's having a significant color change, but then when you step back you realize that it hasn't really done much at all. Or vice versa, you may lay a stroke down that up close looks too chromatic, and so you freak out and soften it out or adjust it, when from a distance that was the chroma that you required to actually alter the form. And so stepping back, or what I'm doing here, I'm sitting back in my chair and sort of painting at a distance, holding the brush from the back end. That allows me to really get a big scope of how the hand that I'm painting lines up to the hand that I'm looking at, and ensuring that I'm making big enough and bold enough changes to actually positively affect color.
Is that enough distance to really gauge that?
On something this small, I think, we're only dealing with 5 or 6 inch tall hand, and with me leaning back, that gets as far as like 2.5, 3 feet. So it's adequate enough for something this small. Anything larger, like if it was a portrait or close to a life-size portrait, I would want to be getting 7 feet back, maybe 10 feet back.
Okay.
I'm really seeing how it looks from a distance. Even further than that rule we talked about last year, the 3 times rule, which just sort of helps us understand or discount distortion and perspective. Getting further back from a painting really helps us see how little colors key into other little colors. So 5 to 10 foot is a solid distance for smaller paintings, and then beyond 10 feet for anything of substantial size, like 3 feet or so.
Are we able to do other things like rest our eyes at it or squint?
Yeah, that should help, because then you sort of discount the individual color quality, but you still need to be sure that you're far enough back, or at least lean back or step back enough, so that when you squint down or relax your eyes, you're seeing the overall color effects compared to everything else in the painting and not just in a localized area. I have enough paint on here now where I can kind of just, as I work it in, shift some shapes and bulk some shapes out and adjust some shapes a little bit um, without the need to always be dipping back into my paint. Unfortunately, we can't see the lower half of my mixing surface, but the premise is still the same here. Down at the bottom is where my lightest lights are that I'm mixing, and then it goes up, you know, right above it to a value that's a little darker, and then as it goes to the right, it gets darker and darker. And it's just variations of yellow and red for the most part. I am picking up some greenish tones at some of the halftones or reflected light, some of those sort of greenish golds. But other than that, it's purely going off of observation. We have a white light on the hand. We don't have a colored light on the hand, so I can't really follow along that warm-cool rule. I think the lights are probably just as warm as the darks in this particular instance. I'm sorry, just the same color temperature, the same amount of warmth. And so there's not really any pushing that I'm going to do one way or another to make it stand out, except to just try as much as I can to match what I see. I think I'm noticing some of the fingers behind the thumb now, so I should be able to start to carve those in. And those fingers are set further back and they're in shadow, so they are going to have a reduced value range and a reduced amount of information. The main thing to concern myself with, at least in the beginning, until I've significantly developed the lights more, is to just get the overall correct shape and correct value of the darks of those fingers. And I'll eventually use some of the background color to carve those finger shapes in and get them a little bit more refined. But at least now I have a nice sort of placeholder for value and somewhat for color on there. Trying to think about the bones now. Now I've switched from walking the form from the major angles and directional tilts to sort of walking the form with little bits of anatomy, like following strokes around the bone and then moving from the finger up to a bone, up to down to the knuckle here. Sort of just dancing all around, envisioning my brush going over the smaller pieces of anatomy. Until I get really slow and specific when I want to carve out the contour. Really think about how it relates to some of the inner forms. that reflected light is tricky. It's not too dark, especially because it's so close to the pole there that's kind of lighting it back up. But it does still need to remain darker than the light side, and I need to make sure I have enough chroma in there. Sometimes it's difficult to see the chroma in those reflected lights because the shape is so small. So if you need to, really get close to your model. I'm pretty close right now. I think I'm, maybe like 5 feet away here. So I can really see some of the color pretty clearly. But you might want to get closer, get as close as you need to be able to see color. There's no point in guessing on the color or making it up if you don't have the experience to guide you. Because then you're not really studying nature, you're just reinforcing your misconceptions. A lot of the red here that's being tossed into the hand is actually, for the most part, this sort of what looks like a cadmium orange. It's actually a molybdate orange from Rublev. It's a really nice warm color that blooms into a very nice warm pink. So it gets all those reds without getting them too overly cool. And then if things do need to cool down, just a touch of alizarin into those mixtures will knock down some of that warmth.
What is alizarin exactly? Is it? I always think of it as like a warm.
It actually varies depending on company. Some alizarins are a little warm, some are a little bluish, so it can actually vary. But remember, you can't talk about warm and cool without referring to other colors because it's all relative to other colors. Okay. In this case, I can say molybdate orange is warm compared to alizarin, which is cool. But that's because I'm comparing two colors. You can't just make a general statement about one color being warm or one color being cool. It's all kind of relative, and it's that relativity that makes it too ambiguous for us to really find super useful. We can talk about it casually, but I wouldn't base any of our understanding of how painting should be done based off of warm and cool. It's more effective to get to the real, more clear description, which is ratios of red, yellow, blue. And so we typically associate colors that are quote-unquote warm with having higher contents of yellow, red to them, and colors that are cool having higher contents of blue or red-blue to them. And so as a result, when I say something like the molybdate is warm compared to the alizarin, which is cool, what I'm really saying is the molybdate is a red that has some yellow in it, and the alizarin is a red that has some blue in it. Mm-hmm. And that is a much clearer and less confusing way of saying what is actually there, as opposed to it's warmer and it's cooler. Mm-hmm. Because the amount of yellow in molybdate orange stays consistent regardless of what you compare it to, as does the amount of blue in alizarin stays consistent regardless of what you compare it to. So it's just one of those little things that I think causes so much confusion and inaccuracy in paintings or misconception and misperception that it would be better if we just disbanded with the whole warm and cool thing. Going in with that occlusion to carve out some of the paths of the hand. With some of these little accents here, it's starting to drive the hand, sort of coax it into its a more true form, which is nice. Those little accents on the fingers, I think, helped quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Now going into starts to describe a little bit more of the knuckles will help as well. We just have to be careful not to overmodel. And in a situation like this, you don't see it with the picture-in-picture, because you don't really stare at it long enough. But in real life, you stare at this hand long enough, and you start to see all sorts of color and value variations on the top of the hand, and it can be really easy to over model it. Overshoot the value of some of the knuckles. That dorsal interosseous for sure, where it bulges between the thumb and the front finger, or the first finger, that bulge can really easily get over modeled too much. So we just need to be a little cautious, and continue to look at the hand in relation to all the little bits on the hand. It actually looks like the picture-in-picture that we have isn't even quite the position that the hand was painted in ultimately. Even though that finger gets adjusted, the tilt that we end up painting it, or the rotation, is a little greater inward than in the reference photo. We're not going to see quite as much of the wooden stick. We really see the thumb and then the fingers right on the outside of that in the shadow. But we still get a pretty clear idea. Working at home, you should be able to do this method from this reference photo pretty well. I mean, hopefully get the drawing even closer if you don't have to deal with a model that's shifting around. But that is the challenge with working from life. You have to be able to learn what you need to change and what can be left. Otherwise, you do just end up chasing the model, and it's not an effective way to paint. I think I was really fortunate when I was learning how to paint because my model was my girlfriend, who now is my wife, and she was an artist. She went to school for art, and then she started modeling after that to make some money after college. And because she understood the demands, I think, of what makes a good model, she herself was a great model, and she just never moved. And so I never had to deal with some of the stuff that students deal with now of shifting models or models with bad attitude or any of the other issues that we encounter with models. Not that all models are bad, but we certainly have our fair share of varieties of models. And I always realize how spoiled I was learning on such a good model who held still so well. There's still the subtle movements of a human being, but it was, she always got back into the right pose and for the most part barely moved, and she would take demanding poses if that's what the painting required. And she was just willing to do it, and it certainly made learning much better for me, I think. And then when I had sort of the basics under my belt, it became easier to work with models who didn't hold still as well or who didn't get back into the same poses.
It sort of feels like it has a nice motion to it that I feel like people don't always get with longer paintings.
Yeah, it's sort of that whole gestural quality I think associated with it. And part of it is just sort of the foiling of angle versus curvature of some of the outer forms, I think. Also, the more swooping directions of the brush marks, a lot of which are we attempt to kind of preserve or at least reintroduce after everything gets softened. So it has a more dynamic, sort of in motion feel to it, I think, for sure. And it's something that if you sort of, like we were just doing, or I was just doing here, identify what it is, what are those qualities that make that more dynamic and more in motion, then it's something that you can introduce into a piece that is a little bit more studied or a little bit longer. But you do have to sort of categorize and identify what are those elements versus what are the elements that make a painting sort of stagnant feeling, and really work to make sure you preserve them. If you want a historical master who worked this way and really preserved a lot of the gesture quality and the dynamic qualities, but still maintained an incredibly high level of realism in his work, just look to Solomon J. Solomon. Yeah, he has this painting of Samson and Delilah, which is tremendously gestural and dynamic, and people of intense poses, and the brushstrokes are just really following the form like this, but very carefully, just really well selected, and the whole painting just screams energy, but it's just painted so incredibly well that it sort of contradicts our understanding of what academic stiff paintings look like.
Mm-hmm. And then they fade off.
Keaton's faded away. We're going to soften some edges now, and then we'll bring Keaton back for a final. I'm using a comber brush to soften here, and it's a brush that's a little bit stiffer. It's been used a little bit more, and I require that to actually push and pull and drag the paint into each other, which if I were using a fresh new comber, I definitely would not be able to do that with. They're just a little too soft, and my paint buildup here is just so strong and so built up that the level of thickness wouldn't allow manipulation with a really soft brush. So this is a soft brush, but it's a bit of a stiffer soft brush, and it really helps to soften things out adequately. I think a good brush to use also would be one of the Master's Choice, the Badger Blend. It exhibits those qualities of being firm with the tip being very, very soft, and so it allows the same manipulation of more direct, stiff paint while softening. And so that would be a better replacement. Your comber has to have a specific amount of stiffness that's built up by a certain type of neglect of not cleaning the brush, and that's not always the best way to treat your brushes, I think. So just knocking all this down. Hopefully my transitions were close enough that, and my chromas were strong enough that as I soften this out, I don't lose too much of my shape and don't lose too much of my color here. And then, this is the very Franz Hall or even kind of Solomon idea, that we're going to bring back the model now, and then I'm really going to start to dig into what hopefully will be some top strokes so that I can finish this off. But first things first, I have this new position of the finger that I think adds a really much nicer shape to the hand, a more dynamic shape to the hand. It's foiling against that longer angle of the main hand and main wrist, and so I wanted to introduce that. I didn't feel like it would be a really difficult thing to introduce. Really, it was just painting in a little bit of background and then adjusting the pad a little bit, and then I might add some value there because it's now in a shadow, or at least more in a shadow than it was before. So I'll need to adjust that just a bit, but I think it was a worthwhile change for the overall gesture of the hand and helping it feel more like a hand. Mm-hmm. You'll find that there's some poses that just make the abstract shape of a hand just look more like a hand. And if I sort of relax my eyes and turn my head to the side, it really just looks like a dinosaur with its mouth open and it has a beak and it's about to chomp on something. And that's the abstract thing that a hand is. It can produce all these weird, strange sort of shapes, and now you just can't stop seeing a dinosaur with sort of a beak. But there are certain shapes to a hand and configurations of the fingers and rotations of the wrist that will definitely make it look more like a hand. And you definitely have to tap into that especially if your goal is direct painting. If your goal is looser painting, meaning less information, more directly stated to suggest what it is you're looking at, then you need to have have your subject work with you. Pose your subject in such a way to where it can clearly be understood with the least amount of information. So when you're way across the room, it still looks like a hand with the shape it's taken. And I think the previous shape with the finger extended, it did look like a hand, but it didn't look as strongly like a hand gripping something as it does with the fingers in this configuration. So I felt like it was an important enough change to make for the understanding of the painting, and it would allow me to keep the painting looser without having to render out more information to make it understandable. I was also able, with that background, to go in and really crisp up some edges, which immediately made the inside of the hand a little bit softer. So that's a nice trick. The previous videos we've done, like with the torso, I really was careful not to paint into the background. The arm, I did have to come in with some background to crisp up some edges in the same way. So this is not really anything new. But it does show you how important it is to introduce some harder edges on the outside, some really sharp edges in some cases, to make the interior forms more soft. Now, one of the tricky things that you do have to be aware of with a hand is that it can definitely get too soft and very, very soon. Over blending a hand is a death sentence because we see so many bones in the hand and in the fingers, just the knuckles, the angularity of the top of the hand versus the pads on the bottom. Even the pads themselves, although they're beveled, they still have a very hard, sort of straight angular quality about them. And so if you soften too much, especially on a male hand, the fingers just look squishy and flat and lacking all the dynamic quality that makes a hand a hand. I mean, this is the same is true with drawing. If we don't make sure we introduce all of the angles in drawing appropriately, then it is going to fall flat. But with painting, it's really easy to lick the canvas, mush those colors into other colors, and then you immediately go from, in this case, like a center plane or highlight suggesting a knuckle to just a mushy, squishy sausage. And so you just have to really make extra certain that you're careful with the all of that edge manipulation on the inside of the hand. You really try to keep some edges harder and foil them against softer edges when applicable. A lot of these marks that I'm laying in here now, I'm not intending to soften or go over. I'm intending these to be final marks. So I'm anticipating or even wanting, a certain level of abstraction. I want this to look like paint, especially up close. And maybe when I squint down or relax or stand at a distance, have it sort of soften into the idea of a hand in the same way that sort of optical blending would work. But I really do want this to have the appearance of juicy, wet, visible paint. Again, slower, more careful observations at the end here. These are the strokes that aren't going to be adjusted, so they're the strokes that have to be the most precise. I have to make extra certain that my pressure is well thought out. If I press harder, the stroke can get wider and lay on more paint. If I don't press hard enough, it will just mix with the undercolor and might not be the color that I want. Or sometimes maybe I do want it to mix with the undercolor. But I do have to be particularly aware of how that pressure is going to affect paint application and color. That again, it's a tiny little accent mark that produces a hard edge that's really required to show the distinction of one finger to another. Now I'm still working with a bristle brush, but that's actually not very common for this stage of the painting. Like if we look at somebody like Sargent, he would build this up in a similar manner, but at the end he would be coming in with a soft sable brush and laying down these final accents. That's normally how I would work. It's just I don't have enough time to go the slow speed that a sable would demand to be able to really lay the paint carefully on top. The bristle, or in this case the ivory, a synthetic bristle, is a little more blunt and firm and allows me to just press a little more firmly and directly, almost as though I'm drawing with the brush. Putting in a little bit of that wrist and the shadow on the underside of the arm will help to set the key for the wrist and hand, uh, both in value and in color and in edge quality. So it's even though I wouldn't want students to really render out too much of the surrounding anatomy, this does put it in enough good context to be worth it. You know, a lot of times we neglect when we're studying how the hand connects via the wrist to the arm, and it becomes too abrupt of a transition and looks a little too artificial. So I think it's good to study that, study the angles and the curvatures that create that connection point. Again, this is not something that's really necessary, but it does give a little bit of context for the hand. Also a nice little loose stroke there that foils against the hand and makes the hand look a little tighter. We'll do some last finishing softening to help foil against all the detail we've built up in the hand, and that'll pretty much be it. You know, Keaton's not even modeling at this point, so really it's just about the aesthetic there.
It seemed like it came out mostly effortlessly for you.
Well, that's what this style is kind of intended to look like, even though there's a lot of thought process going on all at once. And that's, I think, the real demand here, is that so much is going through one's head to execute this that you have to be really comfortable with your drawing skills to get this loose. I'm just going in here with the Rosemary Eclipse filbert to do some last little drawing adjustments and really push some paint together. Remember, it's the same hair that's in that comber brush. It's just a little more densely packed, so it's a little firmer yet still very, very soft. So it's good for this final stage of manipulation here. So just remember, with this style of drawing or painting, keep your drawing simple, lay in with bold colors, and get enough paint on there so you can really sculpt it out. Then come in with those final tidbits and accents. And that's it.